I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Our assumptions about what is determine our beliefs about what ought to be. So, how a society views the question of human origins. Were we created or did we come about by accident? The purpose of life, following God's plan or live for happiness and pleasure. The source of morality, a moral lawgiver or our own choices. And our ultimate destiny, eternal reward or punishment on the one hand, or oblivion on the other. All of these assumptions shape our view of practically every issue. This is the main argument made by the Colson Center's Joseph Backholm in his presentation, Teaching a Biblical Worldview, which he delivered at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary's conference on youth ministry. Here's Joseph Backholm.
So, teaching a biblical worldview. A little bit about me. My name is Joseph Backholm. I work for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And if you know what that is, Chuck Colson's ministry he started because of his interest in Christian worldview a long time ago. He died about 5 years ago. And for the longest time, it was an extension. It was part of Prison Fellowship, which is a ministry that he started and ran for a long time. When he passed away, the Colson Center for Christian Worldview was spun off and it became its own organization headquartered in Colorado Springs. And that is where I have worked since last August. And for 9.5 years before that, I ran a public policy council in the state of Washington. And so I have recently moved to this area from Seattle, and that's a big change for me in all sorts of ways. But in my experience dealing with, and I ran multiple campaigns on same-sex marriage in 2012 and on the gender issues that we had in statewide campaigns that we had in Washington State. And I dealt with every single year for the last 14 years until this year in the Washington State legislature dealing with biblical issues in what many of you will recognize up in the great Northwest as a fairly hostile environment to biblical values. And so that was kind of my, I learned a lot and I made some mistakes, and in terms of how to advocate for truth and reality to a world that is not always excited to hear about it. And so the root of that, of course, is a biblical worldview. And I think part of the reason that you're here is that you recognize the need for thinking clearly in a confused world. And I hope today I'm going to be able to give you some help in that effort, not only for yourselves, but also for those that you are leading and shepherding and discipling, because there is massive need for thinking biblically, because the temptations not to are great indeed. So very quickly, what we're going to do is, as I just kind of hinted at, while the focus here and the title is Teaching a Biblical Worldview, I'm going to spend most of my time describing what worldview is and what a biblical worldview is, because most people have not spent much time working through what that means for them. And if we surveyed the room, I would assume most of you would claim to have a biblical worldview. And since you're in youth leadership ministry, I would assume actually most of you do have a biblical worldview when it comes to answering the questions correctly. But knowing where that came from and how to communicate it to somebody else and how to make sure they're on the path to navigating a world full of confusion and lies so that they can emerge on the other end relatively unscathed, that's the goal we have as disciples. And that's what we're going to hopefully get a framework for today. So as a little bit of an introduction, we're going to talk about why this is necessary. And given the size of the room, I'm a little afraid that this might be too small. Can you guys read this? Okay, this is some George Barna survey. Just a little bit to lay the ground for the world that you are working in the landmines. This was a survey of 1,456 active Bible-believing Christians, practicing Christians. And there are a number of questions, and I'll break this down for you, but basically we're taking questions from non-biblical perspectives, non-biblical worldviews, asking Christians whether they agree with this. And what you see up here is the percentage and the digit written, whether 28, 27, or 32. That is the percentage of practicing Christians who say they strongly agree with the following statements. The first: all people pray to the same God or spirit, no matter what name they use for that spiritual being. 28% of practicing Christians, according to this survey, strongly agree with that statement. Meaning and purpose come from becoming one with all that is, 27% of practicing Christians say they strongly agree with that statement. And if you look a little bit beneath that, you see under 45, which is the demographic you guys are working with. In every case through these series of questions, you'll see that demographic agrees more strongly with these statements than the church as a whole. The question, if you do good, you will receive good. If you do bad, you will receive bad. Now, this doesn't totally bother me because you do reap what you sow, and God is a punisher of evil and a rewarder of righteousness. So there is a bit of new spirituality in this, but this is the least offensive to my Christian sensibilities of these questions. But there's a few more. Coming from essentially a secular worldview, a belief has to be proven by science to know that it is true. 10% of practicing Christians agree with that. 25% of practicing Christians under the age of 45. A person's life is valuable only if society sees it as valuable. 13% agreed with that. 28% under the age of 45 agreed with that. Meaning and purpose come from working hard to earn as much as possible so you can make the most of life. 20% agreed with that. 37% of practicing Christians under the age of 45 agreed with that. Now, from a postmodern perspective, here are a handful of other questions. No one can know for certain what meaning and purpose there is to life. 19% of practicing Christians say they strongly agreed with that statement, and a third under the age of 45. What is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. This is not an unfamiliar statement, but 23% of practicing Christians say they agree with that statement. If your beliefs offend someone or hurt their feelings, it is wrong. 15% of practicing Christians say they agreed with that. 29% of practicing Christians under the age of 45. So as I hope is obvious to you as we read through these questions, there is some work to do. That people within the church have embraced ideas that are not rooted in the reality of the gospel. If that is not obvious to you, we need to talk afterwards and have a different conversation. Now, to get into this, what is a worldview? Fundamentally, everybody has a worldview. You have a worldview. Everybody you ever interact with has a worldview. Most people have no idea what their worldview is, but everyone has a worldview. And I'm going to introduce this description about what a worldview is by showing you this image. You may have seen something like this before. Anybody recognize this? It's a debate that two people are having over a digit. And this image is often used to make the point that, well, truth is relative. You can't always know, right? It's a matter of perspective, and indeed, in some ways it is. We're going to come back to this in a moment after we have described what a worldview is. And this is the definition that we're going to work with today that I think is useful if you get into the worldview space. There are different definitions that people have, all of which are more or less I agree with. This one I think is helpful, and I hope will be helpful for you today. Worldview is essentially our assumptions about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. So when I said just a moment ago that everybody has a worldview, they don't necessarily know it. Everybody has assumptions about these things. They might not have thought about them very thoroughly, but they live life on the basis of assumptions that they have made about these things. What do we mean by this? Our assumptions about origin. Where did I come from? There's basically three answers that I know of. Either I was created by someone, I came randomly through a series of mutations over hundreds of millions of years, or I was reincarnated, which begs another question about where I came from initially. But those are basically the options. Either you were created, and within those spaces of creation and evolution, there are branches to those trees, because some people think God created you and he's very involved in your life, as we would. Some people think God created you and then he just kind of walked away and just to see what would happen. So there are trees within this, but essentially the options of origin are I was created, I'm an accident, or I was reincarnated and I was a mosquito in my last life. Meaning, the question here, does my life matter and why? Does my life matter because I was created and God said my life matters and I was created in his image? Does my life matter because though I am an atheist, I believe I can do good things and that gives me meaning? And so I think that makes me matter. Or am I a nihilist? And I think because I have no creator and there's no intentionality behind my existence, no. I don't have any meaning. You don't have any meaning. Nothing has any meaning. Those are the various options. But everybody basically has an opinion about whether their life matters in some way based on their assumptions about where we came from. Third, morality. How do I know what is right and wrong? Is there a moral lawgiver? Which we would say is our creator, the one who gave us meaning, also is the moral lawgiver. Because he loves us, he created boundaries, and he created this universe, and he said, here's how this universe is going to work well. And if you don't do these things, then you'll experience the consequences of breaking the law. And if you do these things, you'll experience the blessing of living consistently with them. Is that where morality comes from? Or is morality simply born of experience and knowledge? And morality changes over time as culture changes and as our experience changes and our knowledge changes. Does morality change based on one culture or one time period to the next? Because in reality, there is no right and wrong, and it's just a matter of kind of our preferences. So is there an absolute standard of right and wrong, or is right and wrong really a matter of opinion and what we think works best practically? Destiny. What happens when I die? Not a lot of options here either. I can either go to heaven or hell, and there's a number of different versions of heaven and hell from different perspectives. I could be reincarnated to become something better or worse, depending on how I did in this life, or I simply cease to exist. Everything goes black, and I am no more. Everybody has a set of assumptions. They might not have firm convictions, but even if they haven't thought thoroughly through each of these, we all live as if one of the potential options is true. Most of the default position is to live as if I am my own God, that my origin is kind of irrelevant, which means I assume that, I have no meaning other than what I give to myself. If there's a creator, he doesn't really care. I am basically in charge. That is the default position for our culture today. All right? So understanding, just working through this framework of these assumptions that define everyone's worldview, I'm going to come back to this question again, okay? It's a 6 or a 9. And now thinking through the questions about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, is there a way to know, and I'm going to try to get an answer out of this, is there a way to know who is right? He says yes. How would we know what is right? Who's right? Okay, good. Ask the person who put it there. Now, that again, there's an assumption inherent in that statement, right? And the assumption is someone put it there. Now, what would if we're wandering through some part of the planet where we know beyond a shadow of a doubt no one has ever been there, and then we come across that what looks to us like a digit? Is there a way to know what that means? Under those facts, is there a way to know what is true? If we know for sure that no one has ever been where that is found, is there a way to know what is true? No, there's not. Because there's no intentionality. Because of what we know about origins. This digit came about completely randomly, and it just is an amazing coincidence that it looks like what we understand to be either a 9 or a 6. An amazing coincidence. And that's how most people encounter all of life. They assume that everything they encounter is basically an accident. But of course, our worldview teaches us that this digit, everything that we see, has intentionality. You have intentionality. I have intentionality. The kids we work with have intentionality. So there's purpose. So what we can do if we're confused is what we would say is, I don't know what this means. Let's go ask the person who put it there. And that is why the assumption about the assumption that we make about origin is so important. Because if you live your life believing that no one put it there, there's no one to ask. And so everything's just a debate about perspective. And that's where you land on nobody's right, nobody's wrong. It's just a matter of how you look at it. And in some circumstances in life, that's true. But in most circumstances in life, that is not true. So, the questions I want to encourage you to ask: where did it come from, and what is it for? And this is not just helpful in determining whether this is a 6 or a 9. When it comes to teaching a biblical worldview, I would encourage you, as a matter of habit for yourself, for your children, and all the young people you deal with, teach them these questions about life. Where did it come from, and what is it for? We're going to come into another example, and we're going to be able to start seeing why this is important. What you will see here is a poorly sketched human body to represent the human body. And we're going to take the questions that we just applied to that digit, and we're going to ask the same questions about the human body. Where did it come from, and what is it for? Now, you are aware of many debates going on in the culture around the answers to this question, and I'm going to propose a few of these for you. You've seen this slogan before. What comes to mind when you read this? Abortion, right? This is where we hear this come from. And what is the assumption laden in the idea that it's my body, my choice? The assumption at the beginning, when it comes to origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin is, I came about probably by accident, but certainly not by somebody who cares what I do. It's my body, therefore it's my choice. I'm not subject to anybody else's rules. It's my body, it's my choice. Therefore, the logical conclusion from this set of assumptions that I live under is, I get to make this decision. Let's talk about another issue. What comes to mind when you see this? Gay marriage? I think I heard that. Same-sex relationships. This is a big debate as well. Related or unrelated to the previous issue? What do we think when we do this? My body, my choice, right? It's the same set of assumptions that lead to the conclusion that it's my body, it's my choice. I'm in charge. I should be able to do whatever I want. Who are you to tell me what to do? Another issue that has become really controversial in the last 2 or 3 years. Ultimately rooted in the exact same set of assumptions. It's my body, it's my choice. I belong to me. I don't belong to you. You can't tell me what to do. My life has meaning such that I give it. I believe this will make me happy, so this is what I'm going to do. Physician-assisted suicide is increasingly a hot issue being debated state to state, not yet really nationally. Where's the root of this? My body, my choice. It comes from the naturalistic assumption that the purpose of my life is to be happy because it has no inherent meaning independent of what I give it. So if the purpose of my life and my existence in my body is to make myself happy, once my body can no longer do that, I should have the right to check out because my body is no longer serving the only purpose it could have, which is to give me happiness. Because I don't recognize an authority that has some other purpose for my body and my life and my existence. And if their set of assumptions that they're working from are true, it's totally rational. Which is partly why I think not only is suicide becoming more common, it's becoming more acceptable and less stigmatized. Because it is a rational conclusion, a rational result of the assumption that I exist to be happy. Every issue that we've just talked about is rooted in the idea that I exist to be happy, and if I can't be happy, I reserve the right to do whatever I want to either become happy or eliminate the pain. All based on their assumptions about origin. Sex work is work. We have at least one major presidential candidate for 2020 who has Kamala Harris out of California, who is now advocating for the decriminalization of prostitution. Why? My body, my choice. They're all super connected. Now, a bit of a parenthetical in this conversation about worldview, and something that I hope to maybe challenge you with, and maybe through you challenge other people with as well. A lot of the issues that we talked about are not talked about in many churches, and would not want to be, and many churches would not want to have conversations, especially where I came from in the Northwest, because they would say, oh, those are political issues, and we don't get involved in politics. And I'd like to challenge you a little bit with the idea that there are no political issues. There's no such thing as a political issue. So if somebody says, I don't get involved in political issues, they're probably not lying to you. They're probably just not realizing what they're actually saying. And here's why. Politics is a process. What our governments do. Politics is merely a process, whether it's your city council, your church, your family, your state legislature, your national government. Politics is merely a process that we use to make decisions about everything. There's not some set of issues that is political. There are just any kind of issue that could be decided through a quote-unquote political process. We as believers don't get involved in things because they're political or not political. We as believers get involved in things because God cares or he doesn't. Now, we here in the United States and in many parts of the Western world, we drive on the right side of the road, right? Does God care about that? That was a political decision that was made at some point. They decided the rules of our country are going to be that we're going to drive on the right side of the road. You go to places in Europe and they drive on the left side of the road. That is a political issue. We don't really have to care about that because we don't think God cares about that. But the line that we need to draw, and I think this is really important as we disciple people to work through hard things that they're going to encounter in their life, is we don't run to or away from things because they're quote-unquote political or not. We deal with things and we address things based on whether God cares. If God cares, we care. So, back to our body. Where did it come from and what is it for? The assumptions of all the issues, the my body, my choice, comes from the naturalistic assumptions that my life is an accident, has no ultimate purpose, right and wrong is determined by me, and when I die, I cease to exist. So if you're engaging with somebody who is living by this set of assumptions, all of the issues from assisted suicide to transgenderism to abortion to same-sex marriage, all of those conclusions that they have reached flow very logically from the set of assumptions that they have decided to guide their life by, of naturalism, which is, I give my life purpose, there's no meaning other than what I give it. Biblical Christianity would tell you that I was created by God for a purpose. God is the moral lawgiver who determines right and wrong, and when I die, I will be accountable to him for what I have done. Now, if you live under that set of assumptions, you are going to reach a different conclusion about a whole host of things, including all the issues that we just referenced. Both sides of these quote-unquote political issues will lob bombs at each other from their corner. You're stupid. No, you're stupid. No, you're stupid. No, you're stupid. Nobody's stupid. Everybody's actually being pretty logical. They're just starting from a totally different place. So if we're going to engage constructively with people who have reached different conclusions than us about a whole host of things, what we need to do is unwind, go backward, and let's start at the beginning. What are the assumptions that are inherent in everything that you believe about life? And not who's stupid or who's not stupid, who's right and who's wrong. Which set of assumptions is actually true? That's the most constructive, most meaningful conversation that we can have with anybody.
Shane Morris here again. I hope you're enjoying Joseph Backholm's presentation on teaching a biblical worldview. I wanted to remind you that time is running out to register for this year's Wilberforce Weekend. Join us as John Lennox, Rick Warren, Star Parker, John Stonestreet, and more discuss the question, is Christianity still good for the world? We'll also be presenting our 2019 William Wilberforce Award to Mama Maggie Gobran for her amazing ministry to the children and families of Cairo's garbage slums. I hope you'll join us outside of Washington, D.C. for this year's Wilberforce Weekend, May 16th through 19th. Come to wilberforceweekend.org to register. Now let's return to John Stonestreet and Joseph Backholm.
The framework for worldview in generally. Now, I want to get in and talk a bit more about what a biblical worldview is and the answers that the gospel provides to life's, basically to everything in life. And in doing so, I'm going to work through this pyramid a little bit. And you see here on the bottom are the assumptions that we just talked about. The assumptions about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. That's the bottom of our worldview pyramid. And built on top of that is our understanding of what is. Because of our assumptions about how we got here and what the purpose of our life is, I have made conclusions about the nature of the world around me. I interpret facts. Your life, my struggles, the things going on inside of me, the things going on outside of me, through this set of assumptions. That's my understanding of what is. But then there's something that follows. And because of my understanding of what is, I now have opinions and I have beliefs about what ought to be. And that's where we get into these political conversations and economic conversations and family structure conversations. How should we organize ourselves? What ought to be, which flows from what our understanding of what is, which comes from our assumptions about reality. And we're going to talk about how the gospel works through each of these. And this is the foundational assumptions of a biblical worldview. And you've probably all seen this story talked about in some context: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. This is the root of the gospel. This is the Bible in very short form. We were created by God for a purpose. We broke it. Jesus came to redeem it, and God is restoring all things. And we are in that middle between redemption and restoration to a new heaven and a new earth. This is the narrative that we live in, that we live under. And this allows us to have perspective that people who don't believe that this is true cannot have. And let's talk about how this understanding of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration applies to our understanding of what is and what ought to be. So what is? What is our identity? My identity, under the biblical framework, does not come from my desires as the world tells me they do. My identity comes from who God made me to be. That's unique. And so I'm going to have a lot of different conclusions about what my feelings mean. If you believe your identity comes from how you feel, you will react differently to your feelings than someone who believes that their identity is part of it comes from God, and that their feelings are part of a broken nature as a result of the fall. Very different conclusions. Purpose. My purpose is determined by the one who created me, not by my culture, not by my parents, not by my friends, my media, or the world's expectations of me. God tells me what I am here for. And other voices may tell me other things, but I have the framework through which to test all things and hold fast to what is good. And I can find my purpose through what God has said about me. What is right and wrong? And we touched on this a little bit already, but right and wrong are determined by the moral lawgiver, and they are not subject to cultural norms or my personal preferences. I might feel like, and we all are familiar with Genesis 3 and the amazing gymnastics that Eve went through to justify why what she was doing was actually virtuous. It was desirable to make one wise. That apple that she decided, I'm doing a good thing. I'm going to eat this. The way we look at psychology, sociology, and anthropology. I've had the misfortune of being a sociology major when I was in college. And somebody has made that mistake as well, I can tell. But the social sciences, it's an amazing, and there are things to learn from social sciences, and I don't mean to be quite as flippant as I just was. But there are certainly things to learn about causality and how humans function. But when you do not have the creation, fall, redemption, restoration narrative that undergirds your understanding of reality, my big take home through an undergraduate education of sociology is that these people are trying to explain why people do what they do while denying the single greatest variable that explains why people do what they do, which is sin. Their worldview does not account for sin. So they have to come up with all sorts of explanations for why people do what they do. And what their explanation invariably is, because they don't accept that something is broken on the inside, is there's all sorts of things that are broken on the outside. And that, of course, has implications for what government should do and what communities should do as well. What does the gospel say about technology? Well, many of us are scared of it, and I have teenagers, and I'm kind of scared of it. But the redemption part of the gospel teaches us that everything in the world is redeemable by God. Everything has the ability to be broken, but everything can also be restored. And as much harm as we feel like technology has done to some things, it's done amazing good in other ways as well. And everything has the capacity for evil and the capacity for good, because we live in a broken world, and that God can redeem and God can restore. So we don't have to be afraid of things. Implications the gospel has for sexuality and marriage. Not only does recognizing that God is the creator, and we are part of the fall and the restoration and the redemption and the restoration. Not only does that tell us that God defines the term about what marriage is by giving us a supernatural understanding, an eternal understanding from Genesis 1 to the end of Revelations about what marriage is. It lets us know primarily that marriage is not about us, which is the great mistake that the culture is making. When everything is about me, marriage is about me, it exists to make me happy. And what's the natural fruit of this understanding, the belief that marriage is about me and making me happy like everything else? As soon as it doesn't make me happy, what do we have? We have no-fault divorce. We have infidelity within marriage. We have the redefinition of marriage, all because of the root assumptions that marriage is about me. The gospel tells us that marriage is not about you. The goal of your life is not to be happy. The goal of your life is to be like Jesus. And, incidentally, you're going to find great contentment and joy and satisfaction and meaning in that. But that's incidental to fulfilling your created purpose, not the primary goal, which is what the world teaches everyone. So as soon as something no longer makes us happy, we reject it. The environment. All of us, in some ways, I trust, are environmentalists. We love beautiful things. We love going beautiful places. But there's a very different way that the believer looks at the environment than the world. The humanist, naturalist looks at the environment. Who tells us that's our mother? We came from the earth when Genesis 1 tells us that we are stewards. We are to have dominion over the creation, not as overlords and abusers, but as stewards of something wonderful. And we don't have to freak out week by week about temperature fluctuations because our hope is not in the eternality of the earth to carry on the species. Our hope is in God and his eternal plan, and we have an understanding that the creation is broken and it is temporary. We're going to be great stewards of it, but we don't have to freak out about whether the earth is going to, 12 years have they given us until the earth just collapses on itself because of our abuse. And then people in that framework are not the crown of God's creation. People are the great parasite sucking life out of our Mother Earth, right? Because we've inverted the created order based on our set of assumptions. Art, and this is one of my favorites. How can Christians view art? God, by virtue of creating us, demonstrated that he is a creator, and he created us in his image. So we too get to be creators, and we get to make beauty, and we get to make the world wonderful. And that fits within our creation, fall, redemption, restoration narrative because God is a creator and he created us to create. So we get to create iPhones and cars and paintings and beautiful things and beautiful experiences because that brings glory and reflects who God is. Government. The implications for the gospel to government. Because of the fall component of the gospel story, we recognize that there are limits to what we're going to be able to accomplish on earth. And so we don't try to do things that are impossible because of our understanding of human nature. And also, it should allow us to ride the roller coasters of elections a little more evenly, right? Because our hope is not in who gets elected or who doesn't get elected. And we know the Old Testament, and we know that God uses bad rulers, and he uses good rulers, and he's ultimately in charge of it. And we're going to be obedient to what he's given us to do, but we're not going to freak out if something doesn't go our way, because that's not where our hope is, because we know what the limits are. All of this flows from our understanding of the fact that we were created, we're fallen and broken, but Jesus has restored us. So no matter how fallen and broken today seems, we know that there's hope. And that's a framework that should give us hope, allow us to give other people hope, and it's a framework that the world doesn't have, which is why, when the wrong guy gets elected, people do silly things, right? So let's take this and apply this back to our pyramid. So the assumptions, again at the bottom there, of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, affect our understanding of what is. And some of the things that we just talked about, what is. Dealing with purpose, meaning, identity, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and biology. That's our understanding of what is that comes from our assumptions. And then that will inform how we view what ought to be about economics, about government, about art, about entertainment, about sexuality, about marriage. You see how? And so if you take that set of assumptions at the bottom, and as soon as you change the assumptions at the bottom, everything on top of that pyramid changes too. Because it's progressive, it's linear, it's logical. Everybody, we are rational beings. We want to be consistent in the way we think. Just depends on where our assumptions are. To summarize this point, our worldview determines our beliefs about what is and tells us what ought to be. And now, at the close of this. And I hope this has been a helpful framework for how to think through issues and everything that you encounter in the world, and teaching kids what the significance of creation, fall, redemption, restoration is for literally everything in their life. And you can begin to apply that by asking, where did it come from and what is it for? Where did it come from and what is it for? I tell my kids that all the time when they're trying to use their shoes for things that they're not supposed to use shoes for, right? Where did it come from and what is it for? Put it down. Leading students to have a biblical worldview. Now, I'm going to back out a little bit because we've harped on this worldview concept because that's the title of the talk and it's really important. But worldview does not exist in a vacuum. And I'm going to try to put it in context for you. And what we have is we have life that we're all navigating there, which is full of indisputable truths. Things like we all know that we're going to die. That's not a worldview position. Everybody, I think, pretty much knows that we're going to die. We're here for a limited amount of time. And that's information we have to deal with, okay? There are ideas that we encounter. People make arguments. There are experiences that we have. There's just life going on for everybody. Ultimately, our job as disciples is to get to the place where we do the right thing, which is a function of our will. And I've cited there, and I hope you can read that. I don't know if you... John 6:38 is what I said, is the Bible reference up there. For I came down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Though we are talking about worldview here, the goal is not simply to think correctly about things. It's super important, but that is not the goal of discipleship, just to think correctly. The goal of discipleship is to mirror Jesus and do the will of him who sent me. So as we are navigating life, as your students are navigating life, they are operating with a worldview, whether they know it or not. And hopefully, you will help them understand what that worldview is and what those set of assumptions are. Why is a worldview important? 2 Corinthians 10:5, because we are to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, casting down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Christ. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's a daily pursuit. The two options in that verse. We can either be conformed to this world or we can be transformed by the renewing of our mind through the gospel. Those are the options. We are in the process of doing one or the other at all times. This is why worldview matters. But again, worldview is, you do not have a worldview in a vacuum. You are at all times being operated on by external forces. And this is essentially what you are told to believe. And there's all sorts of different sources that are telling you and your students what to believe. Some of them are good and helpful, and some of them are not helpful in the least. You have parents, you have churches, you have friends, you have social media, you have the media, wherever they are bringing in messages about what's good, desirable, who they should try to be, what they should want. Marketing, there's a reason that people spend $1.5 million on Super Bowl commercials for 30 seconds is because it works. They know they can tell you what to like and what to want. So all of us, though we have a worldview, whether we're conscious of it or not, we're always having forces outside of us tell us what to think, and we have to have the framework for how to navigate through those. And some verses I put up for there. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast to what is good. 1 John 4:1, beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. And John 10:27, my sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me, and I give them eternal life. It's the ability to know that all of these external forces are telling you, this is what you ought to believe, this is what you ought to believe, and my sheep. Teaching people and developing the capacity to hear the voice of God through the confusion of all the other voices telling people what they should want. Key to discipleship. Besides the external forces, we are being acted on by internal forces. It's the things I want to believe are true. It's something I want to believe is true because I love somebody and I don't want to believe bad things about them. It could be something because I'm afraid of the implications of information that I don't like. I didn't get into that school, or the doctor just told me I'm sick. Whatever it is, there's things I don't want to believe. There's things I do want to believe. And we know that we're also dealing with a fallen nature and a flesh that tempts us. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Proverbs 28:26, He that trusts in his own heart is a fool, but he who walks wisely, he shall be delivered. So, while you are operating, hopefully, with a biblical worldview, and your students learn to do so, they are also dealing with external forces, telling them this is what you should believe, and they're also dealing with a heart, telling them this is what I want to believe. All of these forces, worldview, the external forces and your internal forces, combine together how you navigate. You will wade through that successfully or not, and you will eventually form a set of beliefs. Knowledge I hold is true. And the reason why Christians do not necessarily agree about all the issues that we discussed is because we do not navigate this with the same amount of success. And just because someone claims to be a Christian and just because somebody is in a church, it doesn't mean they have a biblical worldview. It doesn't mean they're operating from the correct set of assumptions in the first place. And the surveys at the beginning of my talk hopefully illustrated that. But they also may not have the capacity, the character, the discipline, or the discipleship to navigate their external forces and their internal forces. So we are in varying degrees influenced greatly by the voices outside of us, influenced greatly by the voice inside of us. So though we know the right answer to the Bible Sunday school question, I'm more influenced by other things because I don't have the tools to navigate that. So my beliefs that I declare, though I claim to be a Christian, may be miles away from what the gospel says because I didn't navigate the world that I live in successfully. We want people to have the right set of beliefs, which is why we all are here and caring about worldview. But it isn't all that matters, again, because where do we want to be as disciples? We don't want to believe the right thing because even the demons believe and tremble. Believing the right thing is not the goal of discipleship. Doing the right thing is the goal of discipleship. And now I'm going to get to the crux of what I think is really critical as we learn how to teach a biblical worldview. What is the bridge between knowledge and will, between belief and will? And in my estimation, the bridge between knowledge and will is courage and character. And I don't want to be too judgy in this part of this because we've all experienced, I know what is true, but I don't really want to do it. I don't really want to act on it. I know it should be done, but that sure seems costly. Where we want to guide people to is a place where they can take all of the inputs of life, all of the experiences of life, they can translate it, they can react to it, they can develop a healthy perspective, and they can navigate it all to do the right thing, to do what God sent them to do. That should be the goal of worldview. There's so many more ways to screw this up than there are to get it right, because you can incidentally do the right thing. But you cannot consistently do the right thing if you don't believe the right thing. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do the right thing if you believe the right thing, but you're part of the way there. But we have to partner the knowledge, the understanding of the gospel and who God is with the character and the courage and the fortitude to apply it to our lives. So, how do we get them to do this? Things to know if you want to live a biblical worldview. And I did some version of this presentation last night with some of the students. And I give this to you because I think these are the things that you need to impart to students as they aspire, I hope, to understand what a biblical worldview is. Things to know. The first is you have to know the Bible. And this, of course, is kind of obvious in the Sunday school lesson, but it can't be overstated, the importance of this. You will not understand creation, fall, redemption, and restoration and the implications thereof if you do not know the Bible. And you will not navigate the worldview, the external forces acting on you and the internal forces acting within you. You will not navigate that successfully if you do not have God's word hidden in your heart. End of story. So that's we know that's the basis of discipleship, but we're going to go back there again for this. Second, you need to know that tolerance is not a virtue. The primary ways the church is being derailed in our attempts to live out a biblical worldview is being deceived by the idea that it's important for us to be tolerant and nice. Tolerance, the gospel of tolerance, as I sometimes refer to it, is deceptive for the church because it actually looks like the fruit of the Spirit. When we talk about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, long-suffering, forgiveness, all of those things, there's hints of what the culture tells us tolerance is. So we have this, well, maybe I should be tolerant because that seems like it's nice. But the problem is that God and Jesus are not tolerant. And the reason Jesus had to come is because there are things that he couldn't be tolerant of. We not only need to develop severe intolerance for things that God does not tolerate, we need to relieve ourselves of the obligation to be perceived as tolerant by a world that does not share our understanding or assumptions about reality. Following closely behind that, then, is the fact that people will dislike you, and that's okay. I think every single one of your students needs to learn this lesson quickly. And life is a function of our assumptions, right? I moved from Seattle, and sometimes people complain about rain in Seattle, and now I found that people in Dallas complain about heat, which I think is a little bit silly. If you don't like rain, don't live in Seattle, and if you don't like heat, don't live in Dallas, right? Because that's kind of what it does there. And this is kind of how life works. That if we manage our expectations, we're going to be happier throughout the day. So if you wake up in Seattle realizing, hey, it might rain today, and I'm okay with that, then I'm not going to be crushed when it ends up raining. As disciples, if we wake up every day with the expectation that everybody's going to like me and think I'm wonderful because I care about them and I love Jesus, you will have a frustrating discipleship. Let's review the first 12 disciples in their lives. 11 of the 12 were martyred, and the guy who didn't get martyred survived being boiled alive twice. That's discipleship, right? Do you think Jesus was an accurate reflection of Jesus? Kind of a silly question. Did everybody like Jesus? How do we know that? Because they killed him, right? We serve a guy who was murdered because of who he is and because the threat he represented to the spiritual and worldly powers of his day. And somehow, some of us have adopted this expectation that because Jesus was this loving, wonderful guy, if I accurately reflect Jesus, everybody's going to think I'm loving and wonderful. No. There's no part of Christian history that suggests any of that is true. So we need to moderate our expectations. Now, sometimes people don't like Christians because they're actually jerks. That happens, and I hope that doesn't happen to you. And we need to be humble enough to evaluate whether that's what's going on. But we should not have the expectation that because I love Jesus and I'm going to live it out in whatever context I'm in, people are going to think I'm wonderful, because it's not true. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely in my name. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so they did the false prophets who came before you. People will dislike you, and that's okay. Following closely behind that is that people are not the enemy. And this is a tough balance sometimes, as you are living truth in a world that hates truth. They get antagonistic, and disciples cannot get antagonistic in response. Because what we understand is that the people who are so mad at us, they're not really mad at us. They're mad at God. They're mad at reality. They're mad at a bunch of other things. They are not the enemy. They are captives of the enemy. And it's really, really important that as we live out and apply courageously a biblical worldview, we understand who the real enemy is. And that's Ephesians 6. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age. That is who we are in conflict with. And the people that we deal with, though we stand on truth, need to know that we care about them very much. And finally, foundational, I think, to all of this, all the things that when we call people to Jesus, we ask them to surrender their time, their money, their education, their talents, their families. American Christians, because of some of the things we talked about, this desire to be liked, this idea that if I live like Jesus, people are going to like me, it has led us to be captives to our reputations. And that if we fear and we guard those things aggressively because we have a personal brand, or we have a corporate brand, or we have a church brand, whatever that is. And we want to manage the way people see us because that's just kind of what we do now. And we want people to like us. But I would encourage you as leaders, and I would encourage you as leaders of others, to actively lead people in the surrender of their reputations. Because one of the things that is keeping the church hostage from being everything that God has made us to be and wants us to be is this fear that if I do that, people are going to misunderstand me. They will. I guarantee it. But that's okay, because they killed Jesus because they misunderstood him. You will be misunderstood. Much, much worse than being misunderstood is standing on the sidelines of every opportunity God gives you in life because you're afraid of what some pagan is going to think about it. Finally, help them see the world through the framework of the gospel. Now, the best illustration I have of this, and my dad, who was actually here last night when I was with the students, and I didn't realize how unique this was until I became an adult. But when I was growing up, we'd have breakfast in the morning, and he'd break out the newspaper, and we'd just read some, what I think was random. I'm sure he had some preparation, some story in the news. And he'd read the story, and then he'd say, how is it that either obedience to what God said or disobedience to what God said has led to what we're reading about? And usually it's bad news in the newspaper, right? So we begin to deconstruct the news of the day through this framework of, oh yeah, there is crime has risen and, whatever it is. And what did God say about this fact set? And how is it, now that this guy's going to go do 30 years in prison, if we wind back in his life, where is the point at which he could have avoided all the pain that he's now experiencing with himself and with his family's experience, all this brokenness? How did he defy what God told him to do? And what he was teaching me was the ability to see everything I experienced in the world through this lens of God wants good things for you. He gave us rules because he created us and he knows what's best for us. And he knows what leads to human flourishing. And so if we honor that and we submit ourselves to it, we can experience great satisfaction and great joy and great meaning. But if you don't, he's going to let you have what you want either way. You're just going to find out you don't like that. And in a way to teach this concept is the biblical understanding that, joy and satisfaction and meaning comes from being who God made us to be, as opposed to the naturalistic understanding of my life has no meaning and all I can hope for is happiness, and happiness comes from just fulfilling my urges. You can test these hypotheses, right? And in fact, they are being tested every day. And ask your students this question. Are the people that you know in your life pursuing happiness the most aggressively, are they the happiest people that they know or that you know? Ask yourself this. Think about the people who are working hardest to indulge every pleasure. Are they the happiest people you know? Quite the opposite. They are going to be the most miserable people you know. And there's no exceptions to this. Why is that? Because that's not how God created us. He did not create us to pursue pleasure in the way that the world tells us to pursue pleasure. Conversely, the people who spend the least time thinking about themselves and their own pleasure and what's good for them are the most joyful, confident, happy people that they know. Why? Because they're living out their created purpose, which is to live for other people. So there's so much evidence in the world. In every single person's life, there's evidence of the fact that what God said is true. His ways are better than our ways. That his framework, that this creation, fall, redemption, restoration narrative, it doesn't just work. It works because it's true. It works because it's true. And as we train each other and ourselves to see the world through this framework of God gave us rules for our benefit, not to ruin our fun, I can begin to interpret everything I see through this lens of, man, he could have avoided a lot of pain by being obedient. And wow, look at the blessing that came over here because of that person's obedience to what God called them to do. And you can develop the habit where you now have an appetite. Nobody wants to destroy themselves or other people. It's just a matter of being able to see the world as God created and intended it.
Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast with Joseph Backholm. Remember, time is running out to register for the Wilberforce Weekend. Visit wilberforceweekend.org to reserve your spot. I hope to see you there. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.